Hello Stitchy friends! Today I have a fun tutorial showing you how I finished my Liberty Pennies from Hands-On Design on this basic round from Chantel's 141 Design Company. So this comes in 3 pieces. We have the part where we finish our piece, and then the 2 smaller circles are the base. I'm just hitting these really quick with a fine sandpaper to kind of knock off any extra little bits that might be on there. They do come sanded, so if you forget to do this, it's not really that big of a deal. Now, to get the red color that I wanted for my background, I'm using 2 colors of red. So that's really what I want to show you in today's tutorial, is how I did this and how I distressed. So I have 2 colors. This first color is maroon from Folk Art. It is a matte acrylic paint, and you can see I've tested my paints here out on a piece of cardstock. That red chalk is a bit too red, and so what I'm going to do to tone it down is I'm going to do an undertone of this darker maroon color. So I am just going to go all over this piece with that dark maroon color and completely cover it. I'm not too concerned about any brush strokes or any full coverage because there's going to be a couple more coats of paint on top of this. This is just to kind of darken it up and give it a nice dark undertone. So I'm going to go all over this piece, and of course I'm speeding things up so that our video is not too terribly long, and then I will set this aside to dry. And once it's dried, I can flip it over and of course paint the other side, just the same as I did the front. So just a nice coat of paint across this whole circle. Then I also need to do the same to the 2 smaller circles that are the base. So I have a smaller brush here and I'm just doing the same thing, just a coat of that maroon all over. This one is going to go on top of that larger one, so I want to make sure it is fully coated. And then for the larger one, I'm actually just going to kind of avoid the center there because it doesn't really matter. It's going to be covered up by that smaller circle to create the base of our round that stands up. Now the other thing I want to do is paint the edges. It has that dark burnt edge, which I kind of like, but I want to make it a little distressed, like I'm going to distress everything else. So I'm just going over it, just giving it a light coat. I'm not worrying too much if it's covered or not. I just want a little bit of that red paint on there. And I'll do the same thing to the 2 smaller rounds as well. You can see as this paint dries, it's pretty dark. It is a really nice color if that's the color you're going for, but I do want it a little bit brighter since it's a patriotic piece. So again, I'm just kind of going around just haphazard with that paint. I'm not worried too much about good coverage. Now once all my pieces are dry, I'm pulling out this other paint. Now this is a chalk paint from Folk Art and the color is Imperial Red. You can see how red this is. It's very, very red. It was a bit too bright. Now it will dry a little darker than what you see here with the wet paint, but I'm going to paint over this maroon and you can already see that it is a much darker color when I'm painting over that maroon. Even as it's wet, you can see it's different than what is over there in my little paint tray. Now I am being a little more careful with the coverage for this to make sure it's kind of nice and even. My brush strokes, they do pretty much even out with this paint because it has that nice chalky finish, and I am going to hit it with that sandpaper as well. Now I'm using my drying tool here just to kind of dry it a little bit faster, a little bit because I'm impatient. Also, I wanted you to see how dark it is when it's dry. You can also see when it's dry that I kind of need a second coat just to kind of even out the color a little bit. So that is what I will do to all of these pieces. I'll do 2 coats of this brighter red chalk paint on top. So I'm moving on to that larger one. I'm going to do the same thing on this one, kind of paint around. Again, I can avoid the center because it doesn't matter too much. And I'm going to dry it with my drying tool. You don't have to do this. This is just because I'm a little impatient and I wanted to go ahead and get on with my painting. If you had some other things you could do in between drying time, that would be good as well. And then, of course, I'll move on to the large piece and do the same thing. The nice thing to remember about this piece is that on one side you're going to have your finished cross-stitch piece, so you don't need to be too terribly concerned about the center of the circle and how it looks, at least on one side. Now once that's dry, I need to go back and do the same thing to the other side with a coat of that bright red chalk paint. And then I am going to do the same thing to the edges too. I want the edges to match my flat areas, my front and back, and I need to go around and add some paint to these edges. Again, I'm just being kind of haphazard with this paint, going around, just making sure I have some of that brighter red on there because I am going to hit this with the sandpaper and distress it and kind of sand it back to some of that dark kind of burned wood look too. So I want all of those colors to shine through. And this is actually sitting on top of an acrylic block, so it is up off my mat a little bit, which is why I can kind of turn this around like a turntable and do the edge. I can also hold it from that little tab at the bottom that's going to go in down into the base. But you can see there the back side is kind of nice and dry, and you can see we have that really beautiful deep red color. All right, time to sand. So this is some 220 sanding paper on this little sanding tool, and I'm just hitting the whole surface very lightly, and you can see it kind of distresses it, changes the color a little bit, really makes that chalky look kind of stand out. So I'm doing that, and then I'm going to go around the edges with this, and now you can see how I'm sanding off the paint in a lot of places. I kind of want to go a little harder in some places, lighter in others, so that it's not super even and we get that kind of distress look. And I'm just wiping it off with a towel as I go so I can see what this looks like. So you can see kind of there at the top of the circle, I hit the edge a little harder, so I got a little more of that raw wood showing through. And I'm just working my way around, getting it looking the way I like. This is the size of that finishing piece, so you can see there that I don't need to worry about the center of the circle. But now I can move on to the back and do the same thing, distressing the edges of this with my little sanding tool. I really like this little sanding tool. It's kind of a foam handle, so it kind of bends a little bit to the shape of your surface and makes distressing really easy. I'm also making a really big mess with red dust everywhere. So next time I do this, I'm probably going to do it outside where I don't have such a mess to clean up. So I think that this looks really good for the big round. You can see I've got that kind of distressed edge. And so I need to work on the actual edge, that flat edge. So I'm going to go back and forth, not around the circle, but across the grain. And you can see I'm turning my tool a little bit so I get some edge. But as you can see, I'm kind of knocking off that paint. Hopefully it can focus there. I'm knocking off the paint. You can see that dark shine through, but you can still see some of that red. And that's really the look that I wanted for this edge of this circle. So I'm just working my way around the whole circle so it all has that same look all the way around. And again, I'm just using this little towel to wipe all that dust away as I go so I can see what everything looks like. And I really like the way this is looking. Now I need to move on and do the same distressing to my two bottom pieces so that all these pieces match each other. You can kind of see that distress around the edge. I'm just kind of checking, and you can see I missed this part down here at the bottom. So you want to make sure you go all the way around that circle. All right, now to the bottom pieces. Like I said, we need to make sure that they match the top. So I'm going to go across the top of my painting just lightly and kind of rough that up a little, or I shouldn't say rough that up a little, smooth it out a little and make that chalky look really stand out. Then I can go at the edges just like I did on the big circle. And again, I'm making some of them a little more aggressive with my sanding and some not so aggressive so it's not even. And then I will do the same thing around the edge that I did on the big circle as well. So we get that dark burnt char, we get some of the light wood showing through, we get some of the red. And then of course we need to do the same to the little circles so that everything matches. I do think that adding this sanding and this distressing might be my favorite part of the process because you can kind of play and have fun creating the look that you want. You can always put the paint back on if you don't like it and then try again, but I do like kind of distressing all these edges and giving it that unique look than just some solid paint. So here are my pieces together, but I'm not done with my distressing yet. I decided to pull out my distress inks. And I know this is normally a paper crafting supply, but it works really good for this. I'm using Vintage Photo, and I'm just very, very lightly going across the surface. You can see those streaks there of that ink. Then what I'm going to do is take a paper towel and kind of rub them in a little bit, and you can see they sort of stay, but they're not quite as harsh. And we get this really cool, like antique barn door look. So I'll do the same to the other side. I am hitting that edge a little bit where I sanded, so you can see it's kind of brown at the top. But again, all you have to do is go back to that sanding tool and you can kind of knock off some of that color back to the way that it was. But I think adding this little bit of distress ink really changed the look of the surface and made it look even more kind of distressed and antique looking. Now I need to do the same to my other little pieces. So I'll just lightly touch across the top and rub that in with a paper towel. It just adds some dark spots to it and makes it not look quite so even. And then of course I'm doing it to the larger circle of the base as well. Okay, everything is looking great, so now to glue some pieces together. This is Tight Bond Quick and Thick Glue. Putting it on the back of the small circle, you can see where I tested some inks and some staining options because I knew it would get covered up. I'm going to line up those two rectangle openings, and then I'll take my vertical piece and slide it into the slot so that I make sure they're lined up. Now, I personally am not going to glue that vertical piece into the base so I can take them apart for storage purposes, but I do want to leave it in there while it dries so I make sure it's lined up perfect. Now on to my stitch piece. I have the already pre-cut circles from Hands On Design, and I traced it onto a piece of cardstock and cut that circle out so that I have a negative that I can trace. I want to be able to see my stitch in the circle. You can't see through this mat board circle to make sure it's centered or not, and I like having a guideline. So here is my stitch piece, Liberty Pennies, that I stitched on bold denim linen from Color and Cotton. This is 32 count, which is what is called for in the pattern size-wise, not color-wise, but this will fit those pre-cut circles from Hands On Design. I traced it onto the back with a white colored pencil just because nothing else was showing up on that dark fabric. So I can see where my mat board circle is going to go. And then I also kind of traced where to cut. And I did this because I stitched this pretty close to that other stitch that you see there. And I just wanted to make sure I left myself enough room for that stitch as well. So that's why I kind of drew that other line there. So I've trimmed it out with my scissors, and then I'm going to kind of cut an inch or so out from that white line that I drew. I would probably leave myself more fabric than this had I not stitched this piece so close to that other one, but it worked out fine actually. So you can see that's where my mat board circle is going to go, and now I want to add some batting to this circle. So I'm actually just using my tape runner that I use for paper crafting just to hold that batting onto that circle, and then I will trim it out so it fits this circle perfectly. And for this piece, I actually put double batting on it so it was a little more puffy. And for the second one, I want it a little bigger. I want it to wrap around the edges. So to hold it in place, I'm just going to use some tacky glue. And we're basically gluing the two pieces of batting together so nothing moves. And then I'll just trim around the edge. You can see leaving a border all the way around this. And the whole idea is that that batting will wrap around the edge of the mat board and give me a softer edge when I lace all this together. So it's going to go just like that. Now I've moved my batting and my mat board out of my way while I do my lacing. This is the second piece I have laced. I laced my botanical bee. It was my first try and it actually went way smoother than I expected. I'm using some Coats and Clark upholstery thread because it is thicker and more strong. And you're going to see I'm just going to kind of go around the edge with a running stitch, just loosely all the way around, and I'm not going to pull this tight until I get all the way around my circle. So I'll speed this up so that you can see me stitch all the way around in super speed, but I wanted you to see the process. Now I'm no expert at lacing, but this actually was way easier than I expected. I've put something on a circle base before using the method of some double-sided adhesive and pulling the edges around, and I got kind of corners to it. Not that they were bad, but it wasn't a perfect circle, and this actually was way easier than I expected, and this is going to be my new method of circle finishes from now on for sure. So I did tie a knot at the beginning. I don't think I said that, but I tied a knot at the beginning so that it didn't pull out. And now I'm back to where I started. So now I'll put my batting and my mat board back on here. I'm kind of trying to figure out exactly where the pencil line is. You know, I can't see it, but there is going to be some adjusting. And now I'm pulling that upholstery thread tight. So now I have this beautiful circle and I can kind of push it with my fingers, which is what I'm doing to kind of adjust it, get it nice and centered. Make sure my flowers are nice and centered between the left and the right. That's kind of my guide there. And once I have it looking the way I want it, I'm going to tie this off so that this gathered string around the outside is pulled taut and doesn't move. Now, if you have any little corners, what I discovered is once we do the actual lacing back and forth between the sides, it gives you the opportunity to kind of pull out those little folds and the little harsh edges that you might get. So what I'm going to do here is tie a knot. I've pulled it nice and tight, and I'm going to tie it off to where that's not going to move anymore. So now I can start lacing. And I'm just doing some more adjusting there, just kind of pushing it around, making sure it's centered. And now is where I can start to pull out those little corners. And hopefully you can kind of see those little corners there so you can see what I'm going to do. Where it gathers, you kind of get a point in the fabric. And that's where I'm going to put my thread through and just pull. And it's going to start to smooth out those little folds. So hopefully you can see that there. And for whatever reason, I go front to back. I think it's because I can see my folds, but I think you could go back to front. I don't know that it really matters, just as long as you go side to side and pull that string all the way across. I kept getting it caught around the front of my piece, which is why it kind of goes flying everywhere. So I'm sorry about that, and I'm going to speed it up. And I am going to skip through a lot of this lacing because, as you can see, I went everywhere. Just side to side, pulling those corners in. I did have to tie off my string and get another one because it wasn't long enough, but I did use a really long piece of string. This just takes a lot more thread than you might think, just because you're covering so much length going side to side. And that looks really good. I think that all my little points are pulled out of the way. Everything's looking good. And so I'm about ready to tie some things off. So I'm going to pull my last couple. Figured I might as well use up the last of the thread I had and pull some more. And then here is where I'm about at the end, and I'm going to go back through my fabric here and basically tie a knot. Go back through my thread and tie it off. And I'll do this a couple times. I'd rather tie more knots than have it come loose. I don't think that it would because I'll be using glue to glue this down, but I just want to make sure it's nice and secure. And there is my finished round with all my lacing done. Okay, now it's time for some trim, and I pulled some cream colored rickrack from my stash. I think this might actually be from Hobby Lobby, but I'm putting a little mark with that white colored pencil where the top of my stitch is, because this is where I want to start and stop my rickrack. I do like to use some hot glue because I feel like I can adjust that rickrack into the proper place before that glue cools, and then once it's there, it's pretty much set. To me, this feels a little more structured than stitching this on, but you can do whatever works for you. So of course you want to start with a valley at the top and work your way around so all those little mountain bumps in the rickrack is what you see around the circle. And I like to do just small portions at a time. Get that little area nice and adjusted. As you can see, I'm always flipping it over so I can see what our finished product is, because I really don't care what the back looks like. I just want to make sure that the rickrack is even on the front. And I like to put those little valleys in there, flip it over, take a look at it, and adjust it before that glue cools, and then work my way around. And I'm almost all the way around the circle now. Doesn't take very long, just do little portions at a time, and it will make your life much easier, I promise. And of course, I cut more rickrack than I needed, so when I get around here to the top where I started, we'll have a little extra that we can kind of layer behind it and cut it off. So that's what that's going to look like up there at the top. So I just need to finish it off with the glue at the top, and you can see that that one bump is going to go behind the other, so I'm just going to go ahead and trim that off. It's easier to trim it off when it's loose than when it's glued down, I think. And the reason why I marked the top to start and stop up here is because this is where I'm going to put some ribbon and a pin, and so the fact that that bump of the rickrack doesn't line up perfectly doesn't really matter because it's going to be covered up. So while I'm doing all this, I did go out to the garage and spray my piece with a clear coat matte finish spray. So that's happening as well while I'm in here finishing and lacing my piece. I have these 3 ribbons. These are just out of my stash. One's this lacy ribbon. I have this blue gingham, and then this little skinny red that has the white stitching down the middle, which I love that ribbon. And I just have 3 links that I tied into a knot in the middle, making sure it's nice and tight so it can be as small as possible. And I think I decided I wanted the red ribbons to be kind of on the top. And then now I have my single little flag pin from Just Another Button Company, and I'm going to push that through the knot and then push it into the mat board. Just be careful that it's through the mat board and it doesn't come out the back and stab you, which has happened to me before. Now I can trim off my ribbons to the length that I want. I always want to make sure they're longer to start with because we can always trim them, but we can't make them longer. We just have to replace them. And I think that that looks pretty good. I like all those ribbons at the top kind of sticking out and my cute little pin. So now my clear coat is nice and dry. I do have my little sander back out, but that is not to sand the surface that I have sealed. It's to sand off any of the sealant on that little piece that goes inside, or any of the sealant that went into this hole, because I want to make sure it still fits in there nicely. So if for some reason the thickness of the coating makes that a problem, just sand off that little tab, or I use that little file to sand inside that slot so everything fits nicely. Now I'm ready to put my finished piece onto this round that stands up, and I'm using my grid mat to make sure it is straight up and down. So you can see I have that little tab at the bottom lined up with the grid, so I know where the bottom and the top are. And to glue this on, I'm just going to use some tacky glue. I actually like this turbo tacky glue because I think it sets up a lot quicker. And I'm just giving myself a nice bead of glue all the way around the edges. Want to make sure it's all nice and coated. You could put some in the center if you wanted, but this is pretty flat because that mat board is pretty flat, so I don't really think it's necessary. Now I want to carefully lay this down onto your piece, making sure that that pin and the top is straight up. Don't drop it. That's what I'm always concerned about, is dropping it. And then once that's in place, and luckily with this kind of glue, you can kind of shift it around, make sure it's nice and centered. And then I want to lay something heavy on it. So I always go grab this Winnie the Pooh book. And once that glue's dry, I just pop that into the base and I am ready to display this in my patriotic tiered tray display. You could always glue that into the base if that's what you want to do as well. I love the way this turned out. I'm so happy with the finish on the wood piece, and I hope it's inspired you to try painting your pieces this way as well. Thank you so much for watching. Have an amazing day. Bye.